Okay, I'm just going to give it a couple minutes for some attendees to join us. But while we're waiting, we do want to acknowledge that today is Veterans Day. So, of course, thank you to all our service men and women who have served or are currently serving today and every day. So today we've gathered together several state extension agents to talk about the current conditions with the U.S. drought. As you can see, we've got the drought monitor up here. The states that we've got represented here today are Nebraska, Montana, South Dakota, and Idaho. And we've also got specialists with beef, forages, and sheep and goat producers. So hopefully they'll have a lot of really great insights. As we can see from the outlook, we're not looking much better into January. We're already here at Ward Labs seeing producers that are, testing their forages with the last resort and feeling the pinch of maybe not having enough hay for this year. So we also, are open to all kinds of information, and something that I've heard forage producers are starting to get concerned about as well is our soil moistures. Right now, you can see we are located in central Nebraska and our soil moisture is very dry. But it does look like soil moisture is going to improve before our next planting season. So that's some good news. So with that brief introduction of why we're here to talk about drought today, I would like to just cover a few housekeeping things and then introduce our panelists. So if you're here as an attendee, please type your questions into the chat as well as into the Q&A. We're here for you guys, whatever your concerns are. We've brought these experts together to answer your questions. So we'd appreciate that. And then I'm going to just give a brief introduction of all of our attendees, our panelists. So first we have Ben Beckman out of the University of Nebraska. So he's a forage and beef specialist. And then we've got Megan von Emon out of Montana State University. She is a professor as well as an extension specialist in beef. So some great knowledge there. And, both Nebraska and Montana have very different climates. So hopefully if you're a producer, you'll be able to kind of ask the questions that you need. Then coming both out of the University of Idaho, we've got Melinda Ellison, who is an extension agent and works extensively with sheep. And we've also got Carmen Willmore, also an extension agent, and she has a goat herd of her own, if I'm not mistaken. So she has got some of that experience as well. And then finally, we've got Adele Harty with South Dakota State University, who is a forage and beef specialist. And we have sponsored her mineral education program for many years. So if any producers on here have mineral questions, I would not say now is a great time because she puts on a whole program that has lots and lots of experts and resources. So definitely contact her about that. So with that, I would like to give each of you some time to kind of summarize what you're seeing, and hopefully some of our attendees, if you've got questions, start typing them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll start getting to those after everyone's kind of gone through, what they're seeing. So we'll start with you, Ben, and then we'll go to you, Megan.
Thanks, Becca. I guess in Nebraska, we kind of had a fairly dry summer for those people living in the state, especially on the border with South Dakota, and then it kind of spread on down into the western half of the state. And currently, the eastern, half or third of the state, we've received some moisture recently, so that's been really great. We've seen some alleviation of some of the really severe drought areas, but the western part of the state still looking, very dry. And forages are tight. Pretty much exactly like you said. We're really seeing producers kind of scramble and trying to think outside the box for how are we going to feed the herd this year? Do we have enough hay on hand to make it through the winter? And especially with those input costs rising, I think it's just a something that we really need to sit down and put pencil to paper and look at our options, think outside the box, and really see, what we can do, and see if there's maybe some other options that we haven't explored that might be worth looking at, whether that's doing some stockpile grazing, really trying to get the most out of, Nebraska. We're very fortunate to have a lot of crop residues. So utilizing those resources to the fullest of our abilities. Looking at those alternate feedstuffs, possibly doing some ammoniation of some different feedstuffs that are lower quality to raise that up. And just really, again, trying to think outside the box. But I think the guys that are in the best place, we had a presentation by a couple from North Dakota, Joshua and Tara Durkart, and I think they summarized my thoughts on drought. You either have a drought management plan, I gotta get this right, or you have a drought escape plan. You're either in crisis mode trying to deal with the drought as it's happening, or you've planned for it ahead of time and you're putting that plan into practice and doing the things that you've said. And I think the folks that have those plans in place, and okay, we're culling already, we're early weaning, we're looking at all of our forage options, and we're already managing that, are in a lot better place than those that maybe this has snuck up on you, or you're scrambling all of a sudden now. Anytime we can get ahead of things and have that plan in place and deal with it without being in the moment and having all those heated emotions and everything kind of sometimes clouding our judgment, just puts us in a better place.
You can go ahead now, Megan, and tell us about kind of what you've seen and what your thoughts are on the current drought and some strategies that producers are putting in place.
Okay, well, Ben kind of summed up how everything's going here in Montana as well. We are in 100% drought and have been since about July. And it's been a very depressing summer in most of my contacts with a lot of producers, as well as a lot of the meetings that I've done, because everything's been revolving around drought and how a lot of these producers are trying to feed their cattle. This year, we're feeding a lot of straw, a lot of different alternatives. Corn stalks is something as Ben, I'm sure, knows, they feed quite a bit down in Nebraska. It's fairly new up here. And a lot of corn stalk bales, as I've been driving around the state, that most likely would never have even been considered on, let's say, an average or a better moisture year. So there is that. One of the biggest issues, probably, at least, so I'm here in Miles City, and at our livestock commission, there's probably been close to 20 to 25,000 head of cattle, both cull cows and calves, that have moved out of the state probably in the last month. 2 or 3 sales ago, we're talking 5,000-6,000 head, and a lot of those were cull cows. And most of them are moving out of state because we just don't have the availability here right now. Actually, I know more in the north central part of the state, up in the Phillips County area, Glasgow, up in there, which is even worse than Miles City area in our part of the state for drought conditions. A lot of them have actually shipped most of their cows to Nebraska on the western side of the state to graze corn stalks. They're hoping to be able to come back this next spring, bring those cows home for calving. However, unless they get moisture up there, most likely will not happen, and they'll be looking to sell out. We have had quite a few, meetings about tax implications, all of those fun things that I honestly have no idea about how to do those tax implications of selling your entire herd, because how do you bankroll, borrowing enough money to buy $350 a ton hay, or if you can get it elsewhere. We have producers bringing in hay from Georgia, Kentucky, Missouri, a lot of the southeastern part of the United States, which we all know kind of brings its, might be good quality hay, but it brings its own other challenges, such as weeds and fescue toxicosis, which most of our cattle are not accustomed to. And then another big issue we've run into is water quality and quantity this year. A lot of hauling of water because reservoirs have dried up. and a lot of nitrate issues. I have rarely seen this summer nitrates under 10,000 parts per million, which we know is pretty darn toxic. And producers, are having to decide if they're going to accept that risk of feeding those high nitrate feeds this year and how they're going to overcome some of those issues. So, and we all keep talking about drought, but it always seems like it's bad news. And I know a lot of the agents up here are a little saddened by this summer because they haven't been able to give out a lot of good news. So that's just kind of where we are in Montana right now.
All right, so I guess we'll chat about Idaho a little bit. So I have a unique position in Idaho because I deal with both cattle and sheep, because I serve as both the range livestock specialist and the sheep specialist here. So of course, like everybody said, it hasn't been great news. We in Idaho, for the most part, have been in drought for several years, I would say, at least since I've been here. I've been here about 6 years. So our guys are pretty used to dealing with dry conditions, and we had a pretty good moisture winter this past winter, and we came into the spring feeling pretty good. And then it was cold and we never got our spring moisture that we're used to getting. And by June, July, we were sitting in a pretty tough position, like everybody. So the primary thing that I think we ran into, at least in the mountainous area, we have some pretty steep sagebrush steppe in northern Idaho. There just wasn't any water for the cattle, so we couldn't get them to actually get out and use that forage very well. And it's just not, you can see this photo behind me here, that's kind of a mild version of some of these mountains. And so getting water hauled to these places is also not really an option. So that, I think, was the primary issue that we kind of ran into this summer. Most of our guys came off 2 to 3 weeks early. Obviously cold deep. The one thing that I thought was really interesting, though, is most of the guys I talked to were bringing 40 to 50 extra pounds on their calves. So the quality of the feed that was out there seems to be in pretty good condition. I think what we're worried about then, of course, is coming into this next year if we don't get any moisture. And so really in the end of the day, when it's extreme drought like it is, we came out pretty well this year in general. And like I said, our guys are pretty used to grazing these really dry, these uplands get dry regardless of what year it is, and they're used to dealing with that. And so I think in Idaho, we're doing pretty good considering how bad the conditions are. So I'm hoping that we get some moisture this year because next year could be pretty tough on our Idaho industries, both in the cattle world and the sheep world. So I probably missed something, but Carmen can cover me.
Right, so I'm Carmen Willmore. I'm an extension agent in Lincoln County, and so I am in the south central part of Idaho. And so most of the producers that I work with are cow-calf producers that go out on range in the summer, come home, try and graze something in the fall, and then feed hay for the winter. Is our typical setup for our cow-calf producers. And so for the most part, people were able to go out on time, but kind of like what Melinda said, the grass gave up about June or July. And so we had a lot of people coming home early. And then because of the drought in my area of Idaho, we also had a very short water year. So they ran out of irrigation the first couple of weeks of June, which makes it very difficult to have any forage crops to harvest. And so that put us in a pretty tricky situation bringing cows home. Where are you going to put them? Even if you wean the calves, there's nowhere to put them either. And because of all of this, our hay prices have gone pretty high, like what Megan was saying. Hay prices are just unfathomable right now. People, if you find hay, it's that $250 to $300 a ton price. And not a lot of people can afford that with the situation that we're in. So there have been a few people I've worked with this fall, grazing crop aftermath and then cover crops as well. We have had a decent fall for rain, which has been really nice. Some parts of our southern Idaho
we just got our hard frost this week, which is awesome for people that were raising cover crops, because they were able to get, for those that did have irrigation water, they could water them. And then they got this bonus of a couple inches of rain over the past 2 months, which has done really well for the cover crops. I've been out to some places that are, they have Sudan grass, barley, oats that are waist high and chest high in some areas. So they do have some of us do have a good situation for grazing cover crops this fall and hopefully into the winter as those hold out. But I know we've had a lot of people that have had to cull pretty heavy, and with very low cull cow prices, it's been pretty difficult as far as how to stretch your dollar and get enough feed for what you're going to keep into next spring. Most people are, making plans to have a drought next year, but also pretty optimistic with this rain that we've gotten. And we're hopeful for a wet winter that will have a better spring for sure. You can already drive around this area and see the range greening up from all the rain that we've gotten. And then the warm temperatures, it's looking much better than it did at the end of August. So that's kind of our report from Southern Idaho.
So Carmen leaves us with a good positive note. Go ahead, Adele.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in. Adele Harty, cow-calf field specialist for South Dakota State University Extension, and I'm based out of Rapid City, so I cover the whole state, but most of my responsibilities are in the western half of the state. And most of my comments are going to echo what everyone else has said for Nebraska, Montana, and Idaho. We've definitely had some wonderful fall rains that have helped some producers in parts of the state. We were able to get more forage crops. We've got quite a few producers in my area, which is halfway between Rapid City and Pierre, that were able to put up quite a bit of millet and Sudan this year. So that's helping with some of the feed resource availability. But the other challenge is we do have a lot of producers that are still short. A lot of cows have left the state. I know that some of ours have gone to Nebraska as well. We've got quite a few that have gone East River to more dry lot situations because we had a lot of failed corn this year, and a lot of that was put up in silage. So you've got a lot of low quality silage that's going to get put through a lot of cows this year just to be able to maintain some of those herds. We also have a lot of producers who are going to be utilizing some of that straw. So Ben, when you mentioned ammoniating some of those, it's brought back some memories from my time in Colorado, and having that as an option would be a great way to add some value to that feed. The other thing that we've had major issues with is water quality. A lot of our livestock are watered with surface water, and we've historically had a lot of challenges with high sulfates. This year was no different. We did have a lot of sulfate issues, but the thing that was somewhat new for us on the water side of things is that we had a lot of high nitrate water, some higher than a lot of labs had even seen. So we haven't completely identified what the cause of that is, but we are working with quite a few producers who've had a lot of water issues. Thankfully, we do have a lot of rural water or pipeline water that's helped many of those producers get through these times to be able to move to pastures where they do have different water sources. But we've also had some pastures that were either left ungrazed because the water quality was too poor, or they're having to haul water, as others have mentioned. And then I think the final thing that's I'm seeing is we're doing a research project on some sale barns. We're in 6 sale barns this fall, trying to evaluate, what livestock producers are getting premiums for, But the thing that we've really noticed as a result of the drought is that the big calf runs started about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they normally would, and the calves are coming in 50 to 75 pounds lighter than they would, because a lot of them are weaning just a little bit early, trying to maintain some of those forage resources for the cows. So sounds like everybody's got very similar challenges. Nitrates and forages has also been a challenge here, but it doesn't sound like we've had as much of a challenge maybe as Megan has in Montana. But with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, so we did have a couple questions in the chat. I know, Megan, I know you already answered them, but let's go ahead and answer them verbally for our recording. So the first question is from Ray Whitmore, and he's asking about, the prices per ton of hay that you're seeing, if this is an all-time high or if this is an average. And I know, Carmen, you might want to jump in after Megan. I know you kind of talked about the prices being abnormally high where you're at as well. And then he was also wondering if the nitrates you're seeing is more so in the forages or in the waters, and maybe you have some cases that you can share with us that you've kind of worked on.
Sure, Rebecca. Yeah. So Ray, the highest I've heard currently was $350 a ton for basically a mostly alfalfa, a little bit of grass hay mix. And that is shipped, or trucked in. Average right now for, let's say, a grass alfalfa is $275 to $300 a ton. Our straw is going for $150 a ton. I mean, who would have ever thought straw would go for something like that? Corn stalks are about $125. Grass hay is in that $225 to $250 a ton. I mean, I've been visiting with producers and they're spending an extra $50,000 to $100,000 on hay this year just to get some forage. So those are primarily, alfalfa 1,600 pound bales. Obviously straw is quite a bit lighter, so around 1,000 to 1,100 pound bales that we're getting in. To answer the nitrates question, so most of ours is oats, wheat, and barley, just like everywhere else, our highest nitrate accumulators. One of the issues that I know some producers have run into is they've planted some mixes, in hopes that it'll be okay. But, we all know oats is our number one nitrate accumulator. And so I usually offer that word of caution. If you're thinking of oats, maybe don't think of oats, just because of that issue we run into. We've also run into some grazing of weeds like kochia or the Rocky Mountain goosefoot. Those are the primarily ones that I've run into having issues. I know of 2 incidences that come to mind that were pretty severe this summer. One was with sheep, and they lost about 20 head because they had to turn in on kochia weeds around some barns to get some forage into them, and lost those sheep because of the nitrate toxicity. I also know a cattle operation that lost about 20 head. They had two reservoirs dry up, and the only thing green available in that pasture was the Rocky Mountain goosefoot. And so we use a nitrate strip test here in most of our counties. And when the agent and I brought that back to the lab to test just to see where we were, it tested well over 50,000 parts per million nitrate. So it was pretty obvious that was the cause. And, you make recommendations, I guess, as best you can to those producers, like removing those cattle from that pasture, fencing that area off, doing anything to remove that possibility. The problem we ran into is we went out and there were about 11 dead animals. We made the recommendation to move those animals or fence that area off. And the producer made that the selection to spray the weeds, which kills the weed, yes, but it traps all those nitrates. So they had an additional 7 to 8 die. And I think it was one of those hard lessons that was learned. But now they realize the issue with those nitrates. But it's pretty disheartening when you go out and you see that, and it's one of those deaths. It's not quick. It's it's pretty sad to watch cattle, basically suffocate. So yeah, that's kind of my situation here that we've run into. And we've, just like Adele said, we've seen quite a bit of high sulfate water, not so much nitrates. Mostly we only see that around like a field where we might have had any runoff, but that usually requires some sort of moisture. And we didn't have that this year. So even for a lot of our irrigated folks, for hay, they had a lot of their pumps shut off early this year because we just didn't have any water available to pump from. So we more ran into the sulfate high TDS in our waters this year. So.
Carmen, did you have anything else to add to that about the prices of forage you're seeing? I know you mentioned that.
Yeah, so we've seen similar prices, maybe not quite as high, because most of our producers that I've been working with are still trying to buy somewhat local hay, but they are competing with the larger dairy operations that can kind of stomach that higher price. So they're just looking for lower cost feed options. So we do have a sugar manufacturing, so we have a lot of beet pulp. Beet pulp byproducts that they're able to get their hands on to provide for feed. We've had quite a few people looking to graze grain corn aftermath. We're kind of a corn silage area, but I have seen a lot more people grazing that crop aftermath in the fields that were left for grain corn. And so that's been a benefit to quite a few people that can get out there on that. And then they just supplement with some lick tubs and things like that to get the protein that they need. So they're being inventive, thinking outside the box, which is good to see. With some of the cover crops that people are grazing, I've been requested to test. And Rebecca's helped me with some of those. And it's interesting because we're not seeing the like 10,000 parts per million like you've been seeing, Megan, but we're kind of in that with a lot of these being bred cows. We're in that danger zone of, you could put stalker calves out there, weaned calves, put the bulls and the open cows, but you just can't put the bred cow. But what they're holding on to is the bred cow. And so it's kind of a tricky situation with grazing those, trying not to graze all the way to the ground is what I've suggested to a lot of people, and having straw or some grass hay, something else that they can go chew on to kind of mediate the risk. But it is still, you got to use it because that's where your forage is. And so it's just that like risk versus reward kind of discussion that I've had with a few people over the past couple months. So yeah.
Okay, I want to follow up with you on the beet pulp. We don't see a lot of that coming through our labs. We have a few producers that do send it and use it. Do you have any suggestions for producers that are trying to replace a portion of their forage in the diet with that beet pulp?
I would say to send it off and get it tested so you actually know the nutritive value. I haven't seen as much test, but it can vary based on how much sugar they're pulling out of it, how processed it is, and things like that. I haven't worked with it as closely this year as I have years past, but it's a great feed source if you can get your hands on it. I know our plant, you can get wet pulp. They do sell some dried, and then some slurry. And I've seen more of the slurry fed at like the feedlots and stuff than cow calf guys. But definitely get it tested just so you know what you're actually feeding. And so I have guys, they'll just take their kind of like a flatbed with a tarp. They kind of took their flatbed with their tarp and then they put it on the flatbed and rolled the tarp over top. And that's how they're transporting it home. And then they just feed it off the side. They'll put their hay down and then feed it off the side like that. And so I just tell them like, go through and take a few little hand grabs off of that, off of your flatbed. And they're making it work. So
are those plants giving that feed away, or are they charging a lot for it?
No, it is a purchase. Yeah, they're purchasing it based on weight. And so you are kind of buying a little bit of water with that, but there's still feed value even in that. So.
Okay. And then, you've talked a lot about cover crops, and I know that's something that producers here in the state of Nebraska do a lot. And it sounds like we're getting more cattle coming into Nebraska to try and, utilize some of our resources, as we haven't been hit as hard by the drought. So I was wondering if, Ben, do you have any comments on, feeding those cover crops and, crop residues? Any thoughts on that? And have you seen anything or heard anything about all these extra animals that are grazing out?
Sure. I guess when it comes to some of the cover crop, forage crop mixtures, the biggest thing that I always tell folks is to know what you have, and we need to make a plan around that, especially in some of these really high diversity crop mixtures where soil health might be the really driving factor for what they were developed. We need to know what's all in those, so that way we can be aware if we have a risk for high nitrates, if we have a risk for prussic acid, if we have bloat issues or things like that, because we have a lot of legumes in the mix. So just being aware of what we have, and then grazing responsibly according to that is really important. But it is a lot of times really high value resource, and knowing how those different mixtures also play as we're going into winter here. Some of our summer annuals and those species that are pretty much done growing are kind of declining in nutrition. If we had, we've done some studies with some of our brassica mixtures and fall planted oats, and if you got those in late enough, they can maintain quality well into in some cases, January, February, we've seen in Nebraska at least. And so if we've got other resources that we know are going to lose quality faster, maybe that's something that we want to hold on to and graze at a later point. And then just knowing again what we're working with. If we have a really high quality, cover crop out there that's really green and lush, we probably don't want to just turn all the, especially if we have dry cows, turn them all out onto it, and we're probably overfeeding at that point. So doing some limit grazing and slowly, working across that and using some lower quality feedstuffs to supplement and kind of stretch that out, use it almost as a supplement feed, can really help. And so it's just, looking at that whole system and figuring out how we can work with it and how we manage it accordingly. Did I answer all the questions? There was a couple in there.
Yeah, thanks. I know you and I both are very well aware about the Nebraska crop residue exchange, and it sounds like a lot of these producers are sending their animals here for grazing the corn stalks. You really talked about the cover crops, which, like you said, I think a lot of times we are overfeeding the cover crops, and then I see fields that never get touched and nobody ever puts anything on it, just driving across the state, which is somewhat sad. So I guess I have a couple of follow-up questions. One, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that crop residue exchange for any producers that are on, and maybe even producers from other states might be able to take advantage of this program during this drought, since they are sending their animals here. And then also, with the fields that don't get touched, a lot of what I've heard through meetings I've gone to is hesitation because they're concerned about compaction. And I know the university's done some really great studies about that. Can you address those two things?
Sure. So in terms of the crop residue exchange, if you just Google UNL crop residue exchange, that's a platform that we've developed for, I think it's been up for about 3-4 years now. That is kind of hopefully a marketplace for producers. I don't know if it's geographically limited to Nebraska, but that crop producers can put cornfields up, or pasture ground, whatever grazing opportunity, I guess, that they have, and kind of market it. And then livestock producers can go on there and create a separate account and look and see what's available. And it just kind of has a going rate. So a way to, I guess, bring those two parties together, because depending on where you're at, in some parts of the state, you might have a cornfield that you would love to have somebody come graze, but there's no cattle around anymore, which, that's a whole nother discussion, but that's a really great opportunity. We can have some really good quality grazing off of crop residues, especially corn stalk residues. If we do it correctly, a lot of times it can meet most of the requirements for, a dry cow. When we're looking at a pregnant cow or a growing, stalker or replacement heifer, we probably need to do some supplement, but again, it's still a great resource to utilize. And what was, you have to remind me on the second part again.
Those fields that I don't see animals on, and I've heard a lot of.
Yes. That is a concern. We've been doing studies on that for years and years at UNL. In general, the story that we've seen is that compaction is a lot less of an issue than what it's made out to be. Now, there's, your fields, your situation. If you are a crop producer, if you've got a no-till field and we've got a really muddy year and we get some really deep hoof prints, we might have some issues with seed placement. We have to take some of those things into consideration. But if we are really just worried about getting a compaction layer, Mary Janowski at UNL, one of our beef specialists, has done some studies where they grazed through the spring, which in Nebraska, that's the time that we get a lot of our, freeze thaw, we get rain, we get really wet, heavy snows, basically trying to make the worst case scenario. And the compaction that they were able to produce did not impact yield. Actually, in some cases, the fields that they had grazing on, by removing some of that residue, actually yield better. So compaction, it's kind of a big boogeyman. Whether or not it's all it's made up to be, like I said, producers know their fields, but I would say that a lot of times it's worth giving it a shot, and actually, it might not be quite as bad as it's made out to be.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, so we've got a couple questions in the chat. I'm actually going to ask them in opposite order because I know, Adele, you did speak a little bit, as did you, Ben, but we're going to hear from Adele since she's at her location, a little bit about ammoniating forages. And so we've got a question from Troy Salzer, and he's saying, are the poor quality forages getting treated with calcium hydroxide?
Yep, calcium hydroxide.
Challenging my chemistry knowledge to increase digestibility, and that's one I've actually never heard of either. And what about ammoniating to increase the protein content? Is there any suggestions on how to make these processes successful? It sounds like you maybe had a little experience with that, and then I'll open the floor if anyone else has more to add after.
I was just going to say, I'll take a stab at it and then others can add in their experience. So I had a colleague who did a research project utilizing some of the calcium hydroxide on straw a few years ago to increase that digestibility. So we have done research with that here at the Cottonwood Field Station, but I am not aware of any producers currently doing that in South Dakota, but it is a good idea, and it's something that I should probably do some research, and not research, but look into some of the research that's been done and provide some information for producers who may be considering something like that to help with their increase the quality of that low quality straw forage, be able to increase digestibility. On the ammoniation, I haven't actually had any experience with that one. Since I grew up in Eastern Colorado, and so I haven't had any experience with that since I was there, which has been about 20 years ago. So I would say that Ben may have some more recent experience on that. And the other thing is just with the farming practices that we have in South Dakota here, anhydrous ammonia is not something that we find. And so not something that's probably going to be easily incorporated in this area, but I'll let others add to that.
I doubt the process has probably changed much, Adele. Yeah, I mean, ammoniation, again, we need to look at all of our costs and stuff and see what we can get that for and what we're actually going to benefit, and how much we can raise that protein content. And there is the safety concern because we are working with a, highly dangerous gas. But, just basically tarping whatever feed resource we have and pumping that full of ammonia and just letting that sit, preventing any leaks, can raise, the protein quality up of some of those low quality resources. Again, we just need to sit down, put pencil to paper and really figure out whether the costs and the risks are going to be worth the reward that we have on that side.
Yeah, I've had quite a few producers ask that same question this year on the anhydrous ammonia, and as everybody said, it's not the easiest to get anymore due to other factors, but also it's at record high prices right now. So like Ben said, putting that pencil to paper, is it cost effective to do? So I've had a lot of producers actually looking at doing liquid feed on their straw bales to try and help increase palatability and that protein content. But, as I'm sure a lot of us are aware of that old saying, we just won't say the word, but you can't make it, you'll never make straw alfalfa, no matter how much you try and make it more digestible and what other products you can add to it. So I think there's some options out there, and ammoniation is one, adding some liquid feed is another, more processing. Where we run into that issue in Montana is not everybody has a bale processor. We have bale beds. And so we're trying to treat bales, not ground hay. And so there's some other things there. So that's just kind of what my producers are looking at least some different options this year.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Megan. I've definitely seen some forages that have been treated with liquid feed, and so that's definitely something that we're seeing more than the ammoniation actually. So he actually has a follow-up question, so we'll go ahead and address that, and then we'll move on to the next question. Is it possible to use ammonia on baleage and then grind and blend with hay with straw stalks to increase the crude protein in the total ration?
That's a hard one. Short answer, yes, it's possible. Though once again, like Ben said, there's some safety concerns with that as well, due to that ammonia then being released into the air as you process. And we also have to remember that our ammonia is a rumen source only. It then has to be used by the bacteria to create that basically the protein that would enter the small intestine. So there is some things there. You can increase the protein, but it's solely for the rumen. So if you are short of rumen degradable protein, you can use that as a source. But then what is, are we getting enough protein into those cows, especially for us as we're moving closer to our late gestation cows, can they consume enough of some of that forage, depending on how much straw or stalks you include to meet those requirements that they need for that growing fetus as well. So I'll let somebody else jump in there on that.
One thing I know I would be hesitant on the literature, I would definitely have to go and look. I know there are optimal dry matters for actually having the ammonia go into that forage. So I don't know that baleage is going to be your best option for that. So if anyone else has anything to say.
That's what I was going to say. I haven't heard anybody using it on baleage. If you did the inverse on that, and treated your straw and up that crude protein content and then mixed it into your ration, that might be a way to go about it. But again, we've got those, just safety concerns that we're going to have to take into consideration.
Okay. And thanks for your in-depth information on that too, Megan. We appreciate that about the RUP and all of that. So the next question is actually from Rick Raspy. So I'm guessing he's getting on here to give you a hard time, Ben. But I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Melinda because she hasn't, had much to say yet. And she already had spoke about bringing animals home early. So I think this might fit into some of the things she might have seen. And if not, then we'll go to you. But I want to give her the opportunity. So he says, what about the opportunity to develop temporary dry lot on land that can be reestablished after used as a dry lot? Feed a ration that is higher in grain and lower in forage, enough forage just to maintain room and health. That may need to be a limit fed ration.
Sure. I think if you have an area, I mean, we all have that weed patch somewhere that we can maybe convert into a dry lot. And if you have done your cost analysis to make sure that doing that is going to be to your benefit. Unfortunately, we also have high price in steel and wood products to build corrals. I'm building one right now, and I can tell you it was not cheap to start. So those have to all play in, I think, when you get started on something like that. Also, when you're feeding grains, you can't just throw them out on the ground for cattle. They have too big of a mouth typically to pick up small grains off the ground. So you have to have some kind of a feed trough, I guess. You might get away with that in the smaller ruminants. You're still going to end up with some waste, but they can at least get to that feed. So those are some considerations there. As far as adding more energy feeds to your ration and trying to get away from the forages, there's two things that I think you really have to keep in mind. And that would be, to start, the animals need a certain amount of fill, regardless of what you're giving them. They're going to be hungry if you don't give them enough to fill up. So you have to find something to bring in there to give them that fill that they need. The other thing that I see a lot of in both the cattle and the small ruminant world is that when we're coming up on calving or lambing or kidding, we're almost always a little short on protein. And so I think you have to be really careful when you're adding a bunch of energy. They need that protein for gestating, for lactating, all of those things. So it's going to come to a really fine balanced ration that you may need to work with one of your specialists on, or a nutritionist of some kind, to make sure you're meeting all those requirements. And again, making sure they're getting the right kind of protein and all of these different things. The other thing to consider too is that it can be highly dependent on what you have available to you in your area. One thing that I've been wanting to mention since we got going on this, and I want to make sure I get this right, so let me make sure. So the USDA in September expanded on their ELAP program, which is the Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, Farm-Raised Fish program, which essentially covers costs due to disasters of some kind. But they expanded in September to include some funding towards transport of feeds. And I'm not 100% sure exactly what that covers as far as types of feeds. But I think if you're hauling hay, it's going to cover up to 60% of transportation above what would have been incurred in a normal year. And if you're in one of the underserved categories, they cover up to 90%. So to me, that's something I wanted to mention, just because, that's any costs that have happened since January and they're due at the end of this coming January, that you can get reimbursed for some of this. And so these are all parts of what you might want to bring into your cost analysis of something like developing a dry lot or bringing in some other feed options. So it's just something to consider. But I think there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. But if you can make it work on a cost analysis, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to do that. So particularly maybe if you're early weaning or something.
Anybody else have anything more to add about temporary dry lots?
I might throw on top of that, Becca, just at least in Nebraska, and everyone has to be aware of their own regulations, but technically for animals on feed, once you lose a certain percentage of your vegetative cover, maybe that was a chunk of pasture in the past, but all of a sudden that counts towards your animals on feed for your operation designation for the Department of Environmental Quality. And so just in case you got a random spot check and you pulled your, bred cattle in and you're feeding them on feed, that might bump you over the edge if you have a feedlot on hand as well. And all of a sudden you're going to have to deal with more regulations because you went from a small operator to a medium operator. So it's just something that, those regulations need to be kept in mind as well.
Both some really good points there. Thanks. Okay, so actually now we have another question in the chat that's for you, Melinda. Can you discuss lick tubs, how they're beneficial, worth the cost, natural versus non-protein nitrogen? I think you might have some more to say about that, Megan. And then specifically, this is a sheep producer, so they really want to hear the small ruminant side of things. And they had lost some ewes from some toxicity from the lick tub. They did not specify what, but then they did follow up saying that some lick tubs don't have low copper. How do you feed those to sheep?
Yeah, that's specific to the copper toxicity. If you try to feed sheep a lick tub that's not labeled for sheep, you're going to lose sheep. So make sure if you're a sheep producer specifically, we don't run into that quite as much with goats. They have a bit more of a tolerance to copper, but sheep are very sensitive. And there's also some imbalances when you're looking at different species between sheep and cattle, for example, sulfur and some of the different ones that sheep can be a little bit more sensitive to. So worth the cost. The question I think is going to be, did you get the feed that you have available tested? Where are you sitting at from a protein and energy standpoint already? If you're sitting pretty low and you're going to be able to make that up in the amount that an animal can eat in a day off of a lick tub, and there's not a lot of other options, it's probably worth the cost. I can tell you right now that come February or March, if your ewes or your cows or your does are skinny, they are not going to recover that in the midst of the winter, no matter what you dump at them. And so to me, it is worth the cost if it's a matter of making sure that they stay at the right nutritional plane, because it's going to cost you double or triple if you let them get too thin on you. In addition to a million other things that can go wrong, like, pregnancy toxemia or whatever it may be. And so, but if you're right on the cusp of having enough protein in the feed you already have, I'm not sure it's really worth the cost, because they can only gain so much through a lick tub. It's really going to be a matter of, it usually says on the lick tub how much an animal should be eating of this and this lick tub, and that'll give you an idea of what they would gain from it. So I think it's kind of hard to just catch all with that question, but it kind of depends on what you found for feed, I guess. I don't, if anyone else has any thoughts on that. And I'm not the person to talk about natural versus not. Somebody else might want to do that.
Yeah, so Janice wants us to clarify that she did not lose the sheep. Someone around her did, and she's been actually feeding a natural protein version. I'm not sure actually what she means by that. Maybe she means versus non-protein nitrogen. So Megan, you're kind of nodding your head. Maybe you have something to say.
Yeah, so all of our, feed labels, no matter what it is, are required to put on there whatever percentage of protein comes from a non-protein nitrogen source, like urea, biuret, things like that. And so it's one of my concerns with a lot of my producers when I'm looking, when they ask you to look at a feed label. That's one of the key things I look at is how much of that protein is natural, or, let's say from distillers grains, or, a feed type protein versus a non-protein nitrogen. And like Melinda said, it all depends on what your other feeds are. So if you have sufficient rumen degradable protein or a natural protein coming from, let's say like an alfalfa hay, we probably don't need a high non-protein nitrogen tub. You would look more towards a natural protein to help provide more of that bypass protein. and get that direct to animal availability there in the small intestine. So like Melinda said, it's, you kind of got to break down that cost. And I usually advise my producers, look at things on a cost per pound of nutrient. And then from there, we can decide whether or not it's going to provide what your cattle would need. So I just did a quick math there, so if you buy, like, let's say a 28% protein tub, and they're only supposed to eat half a pound a day, you're only providing a little over a tenth of a pound of protein. So you're really not providing a whole lot there unless you're right where you need to be with your other feeds. And I worry about when we get into the January, February, where it's 40 below, just because that tub is labeled as a softer tub, because they use that hardness to limit intake. Are those cows going to stand around and lick a popsicle at 40 below to get their half a pound? So one of the things I also caution producers on lick tubs, which are, I have nothing against lick tubs, because they do a lot of times provide all your vitamins and minerals. That's a way for those producers to provide those things in an easy form. But it's distribution. You can't put one tub out for 100 cows and say, yep, they're going to be good for a week. You have to make sure, because most of our labels say, this tub or block or whatever is good for 15 to 25 head of cows. So if you have 100 cows out there, you need at least 4 to 5 tubs. Then from there, we can determine if, are they eating what they're supposed to consume? Plus, in Montana, they might have to walk 3 miles just to come in to get to those tubs or to their water source in the wintertime. And we want to make sure all of our cows have that access. The first cow that's leading the group to the last cow, and make sure those dominant cows can fight over a couple of their own tubs and then not push out some of those less dominant cows. So those are just a few things I have about lick tubs. Yeah, I'll defer to Carmen and Melinda on the smaller ruminants. But yeah, the copper is one thing we run into quite a bit here as well, because there aren't a lot of tubs labeled for sheep because of that copper. There's a handful here. And it's just something I hate to say it, there is just something we contend with. And I would never make that recommendation to a sheep producer to feed a lick tub or any feed that isn't labeled for sheep on the premise of that copper issue. Because nobody wants to see those sheep have, copper toxicity and die. That's money out of their pocket. And then you've bought all this feed as well. So, it's one of those, you're just probably going to have to look for those specially labeled products.
Yeah, and I'll add to that with the sheep, at least from my own personal experience with the sheep on my place, they don't eat the lick tubs. You buy them, they sit out there, the horses get them, whatever. My sheep typically like the loose mineral a lot better, which you can also get formulated with some protein and that type of thing. So I certainly would test it out before you go buy 3 ton of something, because sheep can be pretty finicky. So just a thought.
Okay, so we actually don't have a lot more questions in the chat, but I do kind of want to bring this full circle. So we're in November, we're past the point of drought planning that, Ben was talking about. But if things aren't getting better, I would like to hear from you guys, your thoughts. What can producers do, first off, to get through till spring? And then if things don't get better, what can they do to plan for next winter?
I guess I can start. So making a plan for next year, I've talked to a lot of people this fall and over the summer when we had a really short water year, making your plans. If you can get crop insurance for your crops that you think you may be short on water, start that process now. That way it's in your, in your file for next year. So you have that to fall back on if needed. Culling is certainly something that we've talked a lot about, looking at condition scores of your cows, age, what kind of calves they've weaned, their feet and udders. If they have one bad teat, just get rid of them now. I keep telling people that because it's going to be a lot harder for them next year if it was hard for them this year. And I know prices are low But it's really expensive to feed them. So it probably is going to be a better option to sell something now rather than, you know, fill it full of $300 a ton hay and sell it in 3 months. So because we don't know what prices are going to be like in 3 months. So those are kind of the conversations I've had.
And I think it's important to touch a little on the range side of things. Obviously, whatever's happened at this point, it's too late to do anything about, but I think it's really important to understand that even if we get absolutely dumped on and we have moisture coming out the wahoo this coming spring, those pastures, those range pastures are gonna need some recovery time. And so don't dump every last cow that you're used to dumping out there. I know it's tough, especially if we come into another year of drought, but you really, really have to give those pastures a break, because what's going on out there is that it's a stressor. This drought is a stressor. And if we add grazing, which is also a stressor, they're getting double stressed and they are just not going to produce, and their root systems are not going to be able to get strong and deep, and they're not going to be able to recover the moisture from the ground. And so the thing that I'm trying to make sure that people understand out on range is that less cows and or less duration out there. Do your very best to leave at least 6 or 8 inches. That's more than we usually do, but just let it at least 6 or 8 inches or more than 50%, whatever it is that you look at. But give those range pastures some time to recover. And usually with a severe drought, like some of us have seen, it could take 2 or 3 years to really recover. So don't go buying cows just because we get 4 feet of snow this winter or whatever. Give those pastures a chance. Otherwise, you're going to regret it down the road. And let's be honest, even if we're not droughty next year, we probably will be again in a couple of years. So I think that's just part of the management planning and making sure that you make that resource go as far as you can.
You want to go, Ben? Sorry. Okay. Nope, you're good. So I think, you know, the biggest thing is to plan ahead and put pencil to paper. You've got to figure out whether or not it's going to pay. You know, we've talked a lot about the high hay prices that have been in some of the areas. That might be something that producers can get by for one winter, but we can't do it for 2. So really being able to look at your herd, maybe making some of those tougher culling decisions. I know Carmen, you were talking about bad udders, bad feet, get rid of them now. I would encourage you, producers to look at their production records, which females are not producing the type of calves that they want to. They're not raising that calf that's 40 to 50% of that cow's mature weight. Those need to be ones that maybe need to go down the road. Looking at your bull battery, those bulls eat a lot of feed. If you can downsize that a little bit, that can save some feed resources for some of your additional, for the cows. Store some of that. Just, really consider, do you keep your replacement heifer calves, or do they go down the road, or do you find somewhere else that can actually develop those for you that may be a cheaper cost than trying to keep them at your own place. And so just try to think outside of the box and plan, and just know that these costs we can't maintain at this rate, because the prices that we're receiving at the sale barns are not going to allow that. And I know that I've had some producers in this area in western South Dakota that are looking at dry lotting cows, and it's $4 to $5 per head per day. And I mean, people are willing to pay it. And I just don't know how long term that can go. So that's what I have.
I would, I guess, add on to that. Culling's difficult because we have so much invested in our herd. And so sometimes bringing somebody whether that's, another family member or someone that you feel comfortable with, but that isn't working on a daily basis with those animals to help with some of those decisions, look at the production records and really say, these are the ones, and they don't know the background that this is the calf that you saved from, the blizzard 5 years ago, and you've got that heartstring attachment to that you really just don't want to let go. Bringing in someone objectively can help make those decisions a little more clear sometimes. So that might be something worth considering. This year, it's really about looking at our feed options and really nailing down on what's going to be the best price. Where can I kind of cut some corners and, maybe drop a little condition here, knowing that I can gain it, or I need to gain it back, now, and just figuring out where those stressors can be okay and where we really need to capitalize on supplementing and looking at some of those things. And then going into next year, having some key dates for decision making. In Nebraska, we've kind of got certain points of the year that if we don't catch a rain by June 1st, we know that, in the central part of the state, a lot of our production is going to be cut in half. If we don't catch another rain by, the middle of July, then we're looking at, another reduction. And so knowing your local area and knowing, okay, I need to have so much rainfall by this date, otherwise we need to start implementing some of those drought planning things, can really, I guess, hopefully make the backside of this, if we do have another dry year, a little bit easier to come out of.
Yeah, that's always the hard part. Nobody likes to cull their animals. I usually use the example because everybody's got Bessie out there. She weighs 1,800 pounds, but every year she weans a 350-pound calf. But she takes cake out of your hand, and your grandkids love her. Your kids love, like how do you tell your kids, your grandkids, that you had to sell Bessie because she didn't make the cut? But this year's one of those years that those tough decisions have to be made. And like everybody said, if we don't catch some moisture here this winter and spring, we're going to be in pretty sad shape next year. And like Melinda was talking about, we talk a lot about, well, how do we get our cows through all these things? But, we didn't talk a lot about the range conditions out there. Montana all throughout the state is severely drought restricted this year. I mean, we had less than 50% production, and it's getting those recovered for next year because we had that really nice open winter last year, and everybody grazed a lot longer out in those pastures than they normally would have when they would bring them closer and feed them their hay. And that really kind of, shot us in the foot this year because we didn't get that spring moisture to help those winter pastures recover. And now where do we go with the cows now? And I've heard some horror stories. We had our sale on Tuesday. Guys are just now making culling decisions, and they're probably going to be in worse shape for next year and through the winter than a lot of these guys that were, being very proactive. We had, basically some downer cows bringing less than $100 is not even worth the truck to town at that cost, at that price. So making those decisions earlier, I think, like Ben said, making those decisions and having set dates, I think is key. And, I wish I could be an economist and be like, nope, cow prices are never going to drop again, or they're always going to go up. And I wish we could say that, but we don't know what's going to bring to the future next year. And, but just thinking about those things, because like Adele said as well, we can maybe weather that cost of the hay this year. We can't do it next year, especially if we don't get any, moisture come spring. And like we kind of talked about, feed availability, not just hay, but if you're looking to feed grains and some other alternatives that you normally wouldn't feed, a lot of our areas here in Montana don't have those available. So making those decisions early, a lot of those guys that made that decision back in June that they were going to early wean by August 1, get those calves off and preg check early, I think are going to sit a little bit better this winter. Hindsight's 2020 at this point. But I mean, I gave a meeting last week and a guy told me he doesn't even write anything down, so record keeping. is extremely crucial during drought years. And you know, you think, I don't know if anybody out there doesn't record keep, but this is a really good year to maybe start record keeping. It doesn't have to be extremely detailed or anything, but writing down which cow calves. You know, I got guys out there that don't even do that. They don't even tag until weaning time their heifer calves, because they're going to keep them. You know, they don't even know who calved. They're feeding open cows all winter long because they didn't preg check either. So, you know, there's some, I think some more basic things to think about that, you know, maybe sometimes us as extension educators, we kind of take for granted a little bit that, oh yeah, these guys are keeping all these records, and a lot of them are, but those that aren't really are probably going to struggle. And so I think record keeping, you know, even if you start today, knowing that, and then, you know, making records of your feed inventory. You know, you probably knew back in August how much feed you had on the place before purchasing any, before you had to buy, you know, before having to make those decisions on who to call. So you could have, you know, we can figure out how many cattle we can feed on what we have available just on the place. And if that means you have to cut your herd by 25, 50%, sometimes those are the hard decisions we have to make. And I say I don't have to make those decisions, but it's a decision I know that is extremely difficult. And that's something you have to talk with your financial folks about, and your bankers and all of those things. So having those conversations before you get in an emergency is probably key.
Well, with that, thank you all for wrapping that up and kind of bundling up your thoughts. I know it's really hard, and I think we could talk about this a lot longer. But I just want to thank all of our panelists today. You guys all shared some really insightful information, and hopefully we can get some nutritionists and some producers out there being proactive with this. So with that, I think that really wraps up our webinar. So thanks again, you guys, and thanks for, you know, Adele talking from the road. And I know you all are very busy just like that. So we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks.